Hello and welcome to another episode of This Week in Global Development, our weekly podcast where we talk about all the headlines in global development. I'm Raj Kumar, I'm the president and editor-in-chief here at Devex, and it is great to be with all of our regular listeners and new folks joining. I'm also joined by two of my colleagues this week. I've got Anna Gavel and Alyssa Violene with me. Hey, Anna.
Hi, Raj. Hi, Alyssa.
Anna, of course, is our managing editor here at Devex. And Alyssa, nice to be with you.
Hey, everybody.
And Alyssa is a senior reporter at Devex, based in DC. I'm normally based in DC, which all three of us are normally based in. I'm actually today in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention. And it's really an electric atmosphere here. I'm sure many listeners have been following the coverage of this convention. And although certainly international affairs and especially global development is not a hot topic, I have to say, in Chicago, there's a lot of celebrity sightings from our community here. Lots of development leaders are in town, and I've run into many of them. And certainly you hear, at least in the tone of the conversations, a strong sense that the Democratic Party has a very different vision, certainly, than Donald Trump's Republican Party when it comes to how it will engage in the world and particularly on development topics. So lots of conversations around climate, around gender equality, lots of conversations about U.S. engagement in the world, kind of an aggressive engagement in Africa, for example, to try to counter what China and Russia are doing there, versus the sense that maybe in other places there's going to be a bit of a pullback if you saw a Trump administration, certainly with some of the coverage we've been doing about their Project 2025, to the extent something along those lines does ultimately get implemented in a potential second Trump term. So lots of discussion here on the sidelines, not on the main stage, but is an underlying theme, I guess you could say, this is certainly not a convention that's America first. It's very much the opposite. And I can say that having just come out of an event filled with foreign leaders and other international observers who are here, and a strong sense and appetite for American engagement in the world that I experienced. But that's sort of what the scene is like. I don't know if you guys have any questions for me.
I mean, it's interesting because the refrain I hear a lot in terms of Kamala Harris's foreign policy is continuity with change, which is an interesting refrain. Like, it's almost like reminds me of the famous known unknowns, in a lot of ways. That's her. She's a known entity, but her specifics are a bit unknown. And I think that comes, especially when it comes to foreign policy and specifically foreign assistance, because this is such a domestically focused campaign, of course, with inflation still hitting Americans hard. So it must be kind of hard to get a read and get a sense of her foreign assistance goals, outside of geopolitics.
I think that line you used, Anna, is almost literally the line from the TV hit show Veep that makes fun of and skewers American politics.
That's right.
And there's something in it which is funny because we don't really know exactly how a Harris administration would differ. There's a lot of conversation about how the party platform on foreign policy is essentially still the Biden platform, as though he were still the candidate. And maybe that's an advantage for the vice president, who doesn't have to pin down her very specific policy differences. I think from what I hear from people's conversations here, a lot of it's going to come down to the people that she appoints. And this is often the case, because if there isn't a very significant policy difference when it comes to foreign assistance between a Biden and a Harris administration, and it looks at this stage like there's probably not a very significant, at least philosophical difference, a lot will come down to the individuals who are running important agencies like the DFC or USAID, or have key positions in the National Security Council or the Secretary of State. What are their areas of focus and interest? And of course, you might have a leader who cares more about Africa than Latin America, or vice versa, or who is more in tune with issues around climate change and renewable energy. So it really does depend a lot on the people. And there's a lot of conversation about who are those people, who is close to the vice president, and I'm sure a lot of the coverage we'll be doing at Devex, depending on the results on November 5th, will be about just that, who are likely to staff some of these key roles in a potential Harris administration.
Yeah. And it's tricky because this was such a rushed handover. So usually you kind of have a sense of who those people might be, but this situation is just so unique. So, names are being floated, but everything is happening so quickly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is what I'm experiencing right now too. It's fascinating to hear about the energy at the DNC, because from my little desk here in DC, trying to figure out, as many folks across our sector are, what does this mean? And we did the same when the Republican Party platform was released, and there was also, a lack of information about foreign aid. So we're doing the same, right? What does this mean for our community? I think a lot of the individuals that I've been speaking to about this have been waiting, kind of somewhat anxiously. Again, we're expecting continuity. We're expecting there to be a great deal of similar approaches that Biden has taken, but I think a lot of folks are curious, well, what will Harris put her weight on? There's certain pieces, and I would be curious, Raj, if you've heard this too. I think the main things that I'm picking out and hearing from folks are Africa, the fact that she did have a trip across the continent, and it was very high level, and a number of different investments were made during that trip. We'll see if that'll continue to be something that's interesting to her, especially in terms of the digital aspect of gender divides and digital divides that she's talked about. Immigration obviously is something that continues to come up. This was one of her, the root causes strategy was something that she focused on over the last 3.5 years. And there's all sorts of political implications around that, and what that might mean for her to take that forward is a question. Something I've been curious about in talking to folks is maternal mortality. I mean, this was a big topic for Harris, and is still, and reproductive rights and abortion, big domestically, but what does that mean internationally? Aside from just the classic switchover, right, between Democrat, Republican with the Mexico City policy and foreign assistance and abortion care. But since she has made it such a cornerstone of her domestic campaign, will that extend internationally to something new that we haven't seen before? These are all the questions that I'm asking, that I feel like people are asking. And curious if any of that hits you, Raj, in terms of what you've heard there in Chicago.
Yeah, it definitely does. And a lot of it, the way I think about it is, what's different had President Biden stayed in the race and won a re-election versus if Vice President Harris ends up becoming the president of the United States? What would be different? And as Anna said, isn't a lot of this really similar? Isn't there just a lot of continuity? Well, we know a few things are different. Like, one thing is, she's the daughter of immigrants, and that may just be, something about her personal background. But I think these kinds of things get reflected on the global stage. And we saw this with President Obama, where the world was so excited and electrified by the idea that we'd have a person who came with roots in Africa, who's a person of color, as the president of the United States, the first Black president of the country. There's a sense of possibility, and America still has that sort of global brand around the American dream and the sense of opportunity in this country. And I think that electrified the world. And I think we could see something similar with a President Harris versus had there been a President Biden, where the world, including the continent of Africa, might really embrace the symbolism that she presents. And of course, the first woman president of the United States, I mean, that's going to have a huge effect, you would think, from an issue standpoint, but also in maybe just the public diplomacy side of things, opening up the world to be very willing to listen to what a Harris administration is saying across a wide range of topics. Many of them may be related to things like maternal health, but even broader than that. So I think you can't underestimate the symbolism of her historic victory if it happens, and the opening that provides the United States from a diplomacy standpoint. It is also worth thinking about the fact that she's in the race does change the potential outcome, right? We heard President Clinton on stage yesterday saying, look, this is still a divided country. This is still going to be a tough race. Like, there's been a lot of admonition. President Obama did the same thing in his speech 2 days ago, kind of trying to rile up the crowd to say, you still have a lot of work to do. Don't get complacent, because it feels like there's some wind at the back of the Democratic Party right now. But there is a chance, unlike as it appeared in the polling for President Biden, there is a chance that a President Harris victory could also mean the Senate and the House. And that does change the dynamic very significantly, because what many leaders have been talking about, and even some leaders here have spoken to me about this, have said, well, yeah, I know we say it's a binary choice between Trump and a Democrat because they have such different visions about the world and foreign policy. But if the House or the Senate is Republican, you're still going to see a downward trajectory on foreign aid spending and a really tough environment for foreign policy in this area. that could now change. If you look at the electoral map and you read the tea leaves, and who knows what kind of bumps you'll get coming out of this convention. But if North Carolina is in play, and Arizona and Nevada, and you may end up in a situation where it becomes possible to see a sweep. And then there's an opening. And then lots of things become possible when it comes to foreign assistance increases, reorganizations, creations of new agencies, things that people in our community wouldn't have even dreamed of in the last few years maybe become possible. That's still a very outside chance, but it's worth pointing out that, here we are 75 days out from an election, and a lot of things can change.
Yeah, so much up in the air. No.
Yeah. Well, we got a lot of other stories maybe we should dive into. I don't think we're going to have time to get to them all, but as usual, it's a busy news week here at Devex. And maybe we can start with a story that comes from our friends across the pond, since we talked a lot about the US, and that is BII. Nick O'Donohoe, who's the head of that development finance institution, is stepping down. He's not retiring, he says to our reporter there, Rob Merrick, but he is stepping down from his role. We had a chance to sit with him and get kind of an exit interview. Anna, maybe tell us a little bit about what Nick had to say.
Sure. Yeah, it was a really fascinating exit interview. He's leaving after 7 years, I believe, at the helm of British International Investment. He said, the biggest question facing his successor will be whether fighting climate change should come at the expense of fighting poverty. And this is a question that I think all development finance institutions in one way or another are grappling with. And according to O'Donohoe, the core function of DFIs is to tackle poverty in low-income countries and deliver on the sustainable development goals, and not prioritize climate finance over that core function. He talked about development, livelihood, jobs, building a tax base. So in a lot of ways, this kind of goes against the grain when you consider how forcefully, for example, World Bank President Ajay Banga has advocated for climate change to stand alongside poverty eradication efforts. So I don't think O'Donohoe was saying, climate change and climate finance is irrelevant and shouldn't be a priority, but it should not be put at the top outside of poverty alleviation efforts. And I think that was very, significant. And I think the other interesting aspect of the interview, he kind of defended the rather generous paychecks, seemingly generous paychecks that the top earners at BII make. They range from £250,000 to over £300,000, and he said the salaries are not, like, quote, out of whack with other European DFIs, and that these employees could easily be earning a lot more. The City of London, a major financial hub, but they work at BII to make a difference. And, I think what was interesting, he's basically said, you get what you pay for. BII manages about, I think it's like £10 billion in taxpayer money. And, you need a certain skill set to manage that money and make sound investments. So I think it was interesting how he shaped talking about the institution and defending BII as well.
Yeah, I think, it is big news. I agree, because he said out loud in public the thing that often people say privately, which is there is a trade-off, and of course, leaders want to say there is no trade-off because both things are important. And there's a lot of political power behind the issue of climate change. And you don't necessarily want to create this sense of tension, but he was willing to come right out and say it, that actually the countries are different. If you prioritize climate, you end up funding middle income countries. And if you prioritize development, you end up funding lower income countries. And he said there is a kind of trade-off there. And that was a big deal, that a leader at his level running a major development finance institution was willing to come out and say that publicly and put it out there. And it does create kind of a key question for other leaders in similar positions to have to address. How is their strategy, which now just about every institution encompasses both climate and development, how is it going to ensure that we don't leave behind the lowest income countries? I don't know if you had any thoughts on this piece, Alyssa.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just echo everything that you've both said, but something actually that I thought was interesting, that this piece related to another piece that recently came out this week was about open society foundations, and just the fact that, our colleague Michael wrote about the fact that a lot of LGBTQ plus grants are now being lost at OSF. And in the piece, he talks about how OSF just announced a $400 million pledge to support green industrial policies. So in a different way, you kind of see this, I don't know if it's exactly apple and an orange, it's kind of might be comparing apples to oranges, but you still are seeing trade-offs, right? Or at least choices being made among different organizations about what money should be spent on, and there's not infinite money to go around, right? So whereas BII has surfaced this kind of push and pull, OSF might be kind of the result of it, right? And to just tell a little bit more about that story, OSF in prior years accounted for 8% of all funding to LGBTQ plus movements outside of the United States. And that's a huge loss, right, for this sector and this part of development. Anyway, so yeah, just another interesting thing to think about in terms of what we are trading off when we are emphasizing climate, and what can be done about that.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
great point, and that OSF story is a big, important piece that our colleague Michael Igo put out, because it's going to have real implications. And as he said in the piece, originally when we interviewed Mark Malloch Brown, who was the outgoing president, he suggested that there probably wouldn't be something as stark as a complete, cut to these institutions in this entire area. But that looks like that's what's in the offing now under new leadership, as Alex Soros takes over the foundation. Anna, you wanted to jump in.
No, I was going to say it shows just exactly as Alyssa said, the trade-offs. There are going to be winners and losers in any restructuring, and it does look like groups that promote global LGBTQ plus rights are a bit on the losing end, although the OSF is trying to kind of make it a soft landing for grantees that are poised to lose funding. And then, as Alyssa said, kind of looking at the bigger funding picture, OSF is not the only donor cutting back on funding. You have in the article, it talks about two top LGBTQ plus funders, the Netherlands and Sweden, who have new right-wing governments that have vowed to pretty significantly cut official development assistance. And going back to the US, if Donald Trump wins the White House in November, there is a very good chance that funding for LGBTQ plus programs abroad may face significant cuts. So the outlook does look quite challenging for these groups looking into the future.
Yeah, agreed. And I think it partly comes down, thinking about OSF, to a long-term debate in the philanthropy world about, do you fund ecosystems? Do you fund the infrastructure, the core operating expenses of organizations? Or do you take this more transactional view of, well, as a foundation, we've got a theory of change, and we're going to kind of direct our funding to the program work that aligns to that theory of change? And it's a tough tension, when you, as OSF does, look at a world that's leaning more and more rightward, with authoritarianism on the rise in many places. You say, boy, it's our duty. We're the leading funder of democracy around the world. We've got to lean into that. And how do we get really transactional and help turn the tide? That's maybe a different set of institutions you fund than if you say, well, let's just support the broader ecosystem of rights-based groups around the world that eventually, over time, over a decade or over decades, will lead to more democratic societies. It's a different mindset, and this is maybe just one small window on a debate that likely is happening inside OSF and that the philanthropy world has been debating for a long time.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we could turn to one of our many other stories this week. We had a really interesting, in-depth look, and I'd love to get the take from the two of you on it, about women in leadership roles in the global development community, that kind of goes beyond the headline numbers, because it's easy to sort of look at, well, what percentage of women are there at leadership roles or across these institutions, and it kind of gets deeper into what are the challenges for women and women of color in rising through the ranks. And I'm curious if you want to say a little bit more about the story, Anna, and give us your thoughts about it.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, obviously, gender equality has not been achieved in many industries, and certainly development is no exception. But on the other hand, there are a lot of unique features to development that make it difficult. There's, extensive travel, living abroad. There's just kind of baked in institutional status quo. And there's, I think, also this notion that, you know, how can a sector that seeks to improve the world be sexist or racist? But of course, as we know, it can, and these circumstances do happen. I think what really stood out to me in this article was what one woman described as death by a thousand cuts. And I think the author Lauren Evans did a good job talking to various women about the trajectory that they took, and a lot were very similar. You accept an entry level position, you you know travel wherever you're asked to travel, you take on more significant assignments, responsibilities. But as time goes by, women start to face unique challenges. The husbands are statistically less likely to trail their wives on assignments. There's the reality of being pregnant and a young mother and busy schedules and living abroad. There's a chance at some point that women might face harassment, discrimination, especially women of color. So, the article talks about for those women who do reach that kind of coveted C-suite office, they may be exhausted, they may be jaded, they may have had to kind of conform what was out of the box thinking into more conventional, traditional mindset, especially if you surround yourself with colleagues who are more traditional, more white, male, European, American, etc. So I think it was a key point that was raised, and it's almost kind of relevant to Kamala Harris, that just having women in leadership roles is not in and of itself going to affect change. There's a lot that has to happen. It has to be bottom up, but it also has to be top down. And there has to be that commitment to change. And I think our sector is no exception. You can't just pay lip service to gender equality. And I think the article gets into a lot of the nuance of that.
Yeah, I like the way the article made it clear this is a systemic issue. Because one of the things I've witnessed in the piece doesn't really get so much into this specific example, but I think in some ways it can be easy for a board of directors of an NGO to say, well, let's do our part and let's appoint a woman of color, let's say, into a key leadership role, maybe into a CEO role, and check, we've done it, But if you don't understand these systemic issues that leader might be facing, you might be setting them up to fail and then blaming them if the organization doesn't succeed. And the truth is, in a lot of organizations in the development space, a huge component of what you have to do is raise money. And fundraising is very much a relationship game, and it's a little bit of a club. And so if you recognize that, hey, there's a systemic situation here where maybe women of color in particular, have been locked out of that club, and you suddenly ask them to get into a position to raise funds, they may find it hard if they don't have those relationships built up. And so I think this piece does a good job of just saying, look, it's not so much an easy situation where you fix it with one hire here or one hire there. You kind of have to acknowledge the reality that women are facing on a larger scale in a systemic way.
Yeah, and I think that Lauren, our colleague who wrote this piece, put in this article, which is just kind of a genius way of encapsulating it, is, how can you expect someone to think outside of the box if they've never been able to go outside of that box themselves? And I think that's kind of what a lot of these women in this piece and across the sector are dealing with. And I think too, there's this other element that I think might be unique to global development and to the humanitarian sector, which is the fact that, like you both mentioned, we're working on topics that are pushing human rights or gender equality or these types of things forward. And I think that the hypocrisy of that can be really graining for people. I think we've all heard stories where it's, I'm working on global health, but we don't get health benefits, things like this. And it's just like, it can really drive people up the wall and make for, a really difficult working culture, which can lead to burnout and a number of other issues. And I think, especially when you look at gender, and how that plays into it. And so many of these organizations are focused on gender equality. But once you get into the actual workings and goings on within the organization, you lose that. And what does that do for an employee and a staff culture and ultimately for the work of that organization? There are long-lasting ripple effects, I think, that this article gets into.
Yeah, agreed on all points. And I think this is emblematic of some of our coverage around localization too, that we can't assume that the global development sector is immune because everyone has good intentions, right? We're still part of systems and economies and political structures, and you can see that around localization in part, where there's a real it's easy to say you support it, but there's a real tension when it comes down to, does this mean I lose my job or my career prospects are diminished or my authority and budget decision making goes down, that gets a lot tougher. And when that rubber meets the road, you start to see real tension. And I think that's just a reality too when it comes to women in leadership roles, and especially the what this article makes plain, which is it's not just about making the numbers look better, but it's actually about better delivering on the mission of these organizations through the diversity of thinking and experience that you get when you have a really diverse approach to hiring. So it's a key theme and a great piece, and I really commend it to everybody who's listening. Maybe we could just get into one more piece before we have to wrap up, which is kind of related to this theme, and that's around visas. I don't know, Alyssa, if you saw that story and you'd like to tell our listeners a bit about it.
Yeah, so this is not a new issue. I think as many of our listeners will know, this has been going on for a very long time. But yeah, a really interesting piece just about the ways in which visas, and on top of that, the choice for where conferences and events and all these other sorts of things that we participate in as a global development sector, where they are can really depend who shows up and who cannot. So I think, just a couple of stats that I think really stuck out to me from this piece. So it comes from everything from studying and, the scholarship opportunities. Like there was one student, I think, that was saying, okay, well, if I get a scholarship, am I even going to be allowed to enter the country, right? And the research on study visas that this piece pointed out was that 54% of African students to America had their applications denied compared to 9% of European students. And then going up into kind of the way in which this affects our sector is at the end of 2023, many African delegates were denied visas, and the author kind of gets into that. And over 300 human rights defenders couldn't attend another conference in Costa Rica for the same reason. So the article goes into a number of different ways in which this has happened. And it's just, I think, an important thing to think about, again, as we're looking at localization and how to really get the right voices into the room. Are we making it actually unable to happen even at the get-go by visas and by this bureaucratic type of thing that could be avoided if perhaps the event was held in a different place or was made more accessible to more folks? So the piece gets into all of those topics.
Yeah, I do think there's really no easy answer to it, right? And the piece, Rebecca Root, who's the author of it, did a good job laying that out, that this is a really challenging area. You can see it blow up on Twitter every time there's a major global conference and a world leader, a renowned scientist, or academic is held back at an airport. I mean, it happens all the time, but yet it's not so simple because even, for example, within Africa, there's visa challenges for citizens of one African country to try to get to the next African country. Finding global South locations that have the facilities to host some of these massive global convenings is tough. There are places, of course, but it's much more limited. And so I wouldn't want to suggest, hey, this is easy to do if we could just take these convenings out and bring them to the global South. That's not going to be simple. Plus, you've got major fixed location convening. UN General Assembly, that's a big moment in the calendar for us at Devex and for our audience. That's in New York for a reason, right? That's where the UN is headquartered. That's not going anywhere. You've got Davos, of course, and we just call it Davos as shorthand because it's in that Swiss mountain town, but it's the World Economic Forum's annual meeting. So many things like that, right, that make it tough. The World Health Assembly in Geneva is another example. Anna, you travel a lot to get to some of these events. What's your take on this visa story?
Well, it's not cheap to go to these events, so it's not even always a visa issue. It's just the exorbitant travel costs. Visas cost money; they can be denied, but sometimes just getting, like I said, to Davos, it limits who can attend. And I think that whether it's conferences or study abroad visas, when you limit the attendance, unfortunately, you're depriving the event and the people there of critical knowledge, on the ground experience. And that, and the article talks about the health sector in particular. If you are trying to figure out how to battle a disease and you have experts who are doing it on the ground, you need, having that collaboration is absolutely essential. So I don't know what the solutions might be, because as you said, it's not just so easy to say let's host something in a different country. But I think what you mentioned, particularly on social media, is interesting. I think that's part of the reason this is a long-standing issue, but you're seeing, and it touches a really raw nerve among people understandably living in the global south who feel excluded. But social media has really highlighted the issue. We wrote a few years ago on how the head of UNAIDS was almost denied boarding a plane for the International AIDS Conference. And this kind of public shaming, maybe, if you will, I think has been critical to highlighting the issue, and NGOs kind of really focusing on not just working with, but pressing authorities and organizers of these events. And so I do think there's been, in addition to highlighting the issue, there has been some progress in terms of, like, with the International AIDS Conference, they've been posting on social media. Here are some of the denials, but we've got scholarships out. We've allowed this many delegates from the global south, helped facilitate their travel and so forth. So I think social media has played an interesting role. That's something I've noticed.
Yeah. And I would separate out knowledge from relationships. And
Hmm.
because there's so many opportunities now to do events virtually, and we do some of this at Devex too, where you can have a hybrid event. People are in person in a room, but you can tap into that expert and their knowledge wherever they are in the world through a live stream. You put a screen on stage, and some of that works really, really well. And of course, there's purely virtual events now. So in a lot of ways, knowledge can be addressed. I don't want to say it's easy because, of course, there are parts of the world where there isn't great connectivity, et cetera, but it can be done. But the truth is, back to our story about women and their career trajectory in the development sector, this is an insider's club still in a lot of ways. And the international organizations world, there is kind of an elitism there. And a lot comes down to who you know and who you have a relationship with. And so the fact is, even if knowledge is being efficiently shared, if you don't have the access as an individual to that event where you can go to a dinner party and you can have a cocktail with somebody, you can get to know somebody off stage in a more informal setting, it's really limiting to you as an individual, but maybe also to your organization, to your issue that you're there to talk about. And so it really does put up barriers. And the visa story is one element of it, as you're saying, costs are others, et cetera. But it's a pretty fundamental mismatch with what the mission of the sector that we're in.
And we all assumed kind of during the pandemic, remote work would be the norm, and these kind of, it'd be more virtual interactions. And we've seen that in person, networking and hosting events roared back with a vengeance because there is that value. You go to a session at the UN General Assembly, which of course is informative, but it's invaluable to be there in person, to afterward go up to the speaker and introduce yourself. So it can be something as simple as that and have that FaceTime. So I think, yeah, I think that's an excellent point in terms of the opportunities, the networking opportunities that present themselves.
We certainly see it with our own events. Right? Devex hosts more than 100 events a year. And we thought, as you said, a lot of these could just become virtual during the pandemic. There's a sense that's where we're all going. It's the opposite now. For our UN General Assembly events coming up in just a few weeks, we have never seen more interest, more people trying to register to attend, to get in. The numbers are just off the charts because I think, as you say, there's just a huge appetite and a recognition that, you got to be in the room where it happens, to quote Hamilton, the play, you got to be there. Alyssa, any final thoughts from you on this?
No, I think you've all covered it. Lots of interesting stuff to address, and we'll see again. Yeah, the next kind of array of social media posts that might come out of UNGA in the coming weeks as our community rushes to New York to attend. So let's see what happens.
Nice. Well, speaking of events, I'm going to close us out here and get back to this event here at the Chicago, the Democratic National Convention, which, if you haven't been to a convention, of course, it's what you see on television and the pictures, the official events in the giant stadium, the big speeches and all that. But there are hundreds, probably thousands of side events, parties, just walking the halls and wandering Chicago. There's so much going on here, exactly emblematic of the conversation we've been having about events. So I'm going to get back to that and see what else I can dig up that's relevant to the global development community. But we will be back next week with another episode of This Week in Global Development. Thanks so much, Alyssa and Anna, for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Enjoy.